I made a game in 1 week for the Black and White Game Jam where you could only use 2 colors. This was my first time doing a solo game jam and it was challenging to use such a small color palette, but here's the story of how I made Fortnite. Oh wait, wrong game. There we go. The rules of the jam were simple. You can only use 2 colors in the game, but things like post-processing, anti-aliasing, and adjusting the alpha channel were allowed. And so the jam started on April 1st and the theme was announced to be Loop. This wasn't my favorite theme and it was pretty generic, so I had some trouble getting inspiration, which led me to procrastinate for a couple days. But eventually, a week before the deadline, I decided to get started and came up with a game idea. I wanted to make a 2D puzzle game where you play as a lost knight trying to find its way to his fort, and the objective is to reach the flag inside. To incorporate the theme, I wanted to implement a time loop mechanic where every time the player dies, their previous actions are replayed by ghosts. The game will also have puzzle elements such as buttons that enable bridges or open gates, as well as enemies that the player must defeat. And so the player must think ahead and use their ghosts to solve puzzles, defeat enemies, and reach the objective. After coming up with a game idea, I got to work and started by looking online for some free assets, and I found this tile set by Kenny that had a lot of great sprites that fit my game idea, so I downloaded it and got started on creating a sample scene. I then played around with different colors that I could use for the game, and eventually settled on this navy and gold pair that I really liked. Next, I implemented player movement and decided to go with a grid-based system where the player can only move in 4 directions, and this is how it turned out. I then added collision so the player can't walk through walls and the first obstacle, which is supposed to look like lava and makes the player die if they walk into it. Now that the player was able to die, I got started on the ghost mechanic. I wanted to do this by keeping track of each move the player does and its timing, so when the player moves right, I would store the move type and the time in milliseconds. Using this data, I can move the ghost objects and have them replay all the actions at the correct time. So I created an enum that represents all the action types the player can do and a class that stores the action type and timing for each player move. I also updated the player movement script to determine the type of action based on the player input, the timing since the scene started, and added this to a list. Before adding the player ghost, I tested this out by printing each player move. With the move data being stored correctly, I updated the scene manager so that it loops through the list of previous lives and instantiates a player clone for each. It assigns a list of moves to the clone and disables its collision with the player and other player clones. And it was time to test it out. It seemed to be working fine, but I noticed it was hard to tell which one was the player, so I lowered the opacity of the ghost. Next, I moved on to adding the first puzzle element, a button that opens a bridge so the player would have to press a button with their ghost to reach the flag. At this point, the basic mechanics were done, but I wanted to improve the overall feel of the game, so I created an idle animation for the player since the tile set didn't have any animations. I also added the left and right facing player sprites as well as their animations to make the player movement more responsive. I think that looked a lot better, so I moved on to adding the first enemy, a skeleton that shoots arrows. I know, very original, right? I added the skeleton to the game and gave it a similar idle animation as well as a shooting animation. I then implemented the shooting mechanic and made the player die if they are hit by an arrow. Next up was adding the player attack, so I headed back to Sprite and created the animation for it. I then implemented the attacking system and updated the ghost mechanic so the player ghost can also replay an attack action. It was day 3 of working on the game, and after doing some testing, I realized it was a bit too easy with the player basically having an endless amount of lives. So I introduced a new hunger mechanic where the number of moves of the player is limited by their food level. And if they run out of food, they're unable to move. I also added food pickups that increases the player's food level by different amounts, but these items are shared with the player's ghost, which makes the player consider their moves carefully and think ahead. This sometimes causes the player to get stuck if they run out of food, so I added a button that kills the player as well as a button that restarts the whole level. I really like this food mechanic and I think it made the game more interesting. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Next, it was finally time to design some levels, so I got started on the first level. I wanted to keep the first level simple to introduce the player to the different mechanics. So I made it similar to the test scene I had made and didn't add any enemies. At the end, this is how it turned out. At this point, I still didn't have any audio, so that's what I decided to work on before designing more levels. So I found this music on freesound.org and added it to the game, as well as some sound effects for the button pressing, player death, and level completion. And here's a short clip after I put it all together. With the music done, I wanted to add some smaller details such as some lighting to the torches and the player, as well as a player death animation. It was day 5 and there were 2 days left until the deadline, so I continued designing some more levels. This is how the second level turned out, and for this one I added a gate that's also opened by the button. I won't bore you with more time lapses, but I designed a total of 5 levels for the rest of the day. The first 2 were meant to be a bit simpler so the player can understand the game mechanics. On the last day, I added a main menu with a button to turn off audio and an instructions page. As an Easter egg, I also made the player in the main menu controllable. Unfortunately, I didn't have much time to have anyone playtest the game, so I had no idea if the levels were too easy or difficult. But I finally created the itch.io page for the game and submitted it to the game jam. The link will be in the description, so let me know if you tried it out and how you liked it. At the end, there were 350 entries in the jam, and my game got 60th overall, which wasn't bad. I received a lot of comments and feedback about the game, including some people reporting this weird graphic bug, which I still have no clue how it happens. I also received a lot of feedback stating that the levels were pretty difficult, and I realized I probably should have simplified the first few levels even more to gradually introduce different elements to the player. There were a lot of things that I didn't have time to add, such as more puzzle elements, levels, and enemies, but overall I really enjoyed making this game and playing it. I am considering making this into a full game, so let me know what you think in the comments. And as always, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, it really helps with the algorithm. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.